Time now for With All Due Respect. My name is Olive Burrows. I am sitting in for one James Smart, our sign language interpreter. As I mentioned right before we took the break, when we closed NTV tonight, is Flora Atieno. With me in studio this evening, we have the Foreign Affairs Principal Secretary, Korir Singoe. Karibu Sana. And to begin with, I'm curious what you make of this tweet that was posted, let me see, at 8:32 p.m. by your boss. My friend Raila Odinga, I'm off to Tanzania for a human capital meeting to harmonize the expansion of employment opportunities in our continent. I'm back tomorrow evening, and as you have always known, I'm available to meet one-on-one with you anytime at your convenience.
I think it's President Ruto basically saying that he has never had any reservations about having a sit-down with his brother and friend, the Right Honorable former Prime Minister Raila Odinga. I think he's just confirming that for the uptenth time, I think.
Do you think the pressure that has come from various sources, including the international community, which we'll be talking about in the course of this discussion, led to this point?
I don't think so. I think quite to the contrary. You know, the president has time and time again indicated his willingness to meet and to engage, basically on a very clear framework. Particularly in relation to meeting one-on-one with Honorable Odinga, the president has had no reservations.
Has had no reservations.
But he's under no pressure, no compulsion, no coercion to meet with the former Prime Minister.
You're certain about that?
Absolutely.
All right. There's a time when there was this talk of there will be no handshake, there will be no sharing of government power or positions. You had taken the view that you saw no problem in dialogue, in conversing, in talks.
That's precisely the position the president is reiterating. The meeting of leaders to be able to converse around, challenges that a country may be facing, to my mind, not incompatible with the principle the president has stated here.
Okay. Let's hear what Raila Odinga had to say on the subject of dialogue in this soundbite.
See, but you need to also know that there have been also attempts from outside. I can now say it here, that the president from Tanzania came here 2 weeks ago at the invitation of President Ruto to mediate. And she was kept waiting, not from our side. We were available, but the other side was not available. She spent 2 nights here, and it was all in vain. Other people have tried. Right now I know that other people are also trying, but he's the one who's resisting. So he basically knows what he wants. I myself have said I'm ready to sit with other people to discuss these issues. He is actually pretending, he's living in delusion that we don't have a crisis. But we have a serious crisis that requires patriotism to resolve. And we are ready ourselves.
Several issues come up from that soundbite. One, I'm curious, did this administration keep the Tanzanian president in limbo for 2 days as she sought to mediate a, quote, ceasefire? 2, Raila Odinga says it is the president who has, up until this point, been unwilling to talk. So do you still maintain that the president is not bowing to pressure?
Let me make it very clear, as Principal Secretary for Foreign Affairs, that the visit to a country by any head of state is a matter that we take very, very seriously. And it is governed by very, very clear protocols. And in none of those protocols is there the involvement of a leader of opposition, or anybody outside of government. It's a matter that we treat with utmost seriousness. Moreover, if in fact there was a case in which President Samia visited Kenya in her private capacity, the only obligation we have as a Kenyan government is to make sure that she has safe passage and that she's accorded her privacy if she's here on a private capacity. And so I want to be very, very categorical that at no one time was the president of Tanzania, a friendly neighboring country, subjected to the treatment that Honorable Odinga has spoken about. At no one time has that happened on our soil, because we have very, very clear protocols about how we deal with heads of state.
That did not happen. We continue with all due respect on the other side of this break.
I think we are all bound by the principles and the doctrines of the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations. This convention that indeed has acquired customary international status and whose principles are now, jus cogens, provides amongst others in Article 41.1 that there shall be non-interference in internal affairs of the host state. Now, of course, it is permissible for the international community to engage on certain issues. But there are thresholds. Within the African constitutional system, particularly under the AU framework, there are circumstances in which states can speak to ongoing developments in another member state. Those circumstances, Excellencies, are mainly in the nature of the commission of atrocity crimes. If there are developments that acquire a certain level of threshold, then the international community can speak to them. Now, the danger of speaking out of turn or speaking too soon sometimes is that it can feed the very beast that we are all trying to manage. It can provide justification for insurgent actors to be able to legitimate their claims.
All right, I transcribed a bit of what you said in that soundbite, and you are a doctor. There is a professor, I'm sure you're acquainted with Professor Mgaya Ketch, and this was his response on Twitter to those remarks, and he said, the danger of not speaking soon enough is that it encourages despots to commit crimes such as genocide with impunity. Rwanda taught us that the, quote, responsibility to protect, now this is a principle I was told to look up, requires the international community to speak up at the earliest opportunity. You said there is a danger to the international community speaking too soon or out of turn. Your thoughts? Because there were several comparisons which were made, people responding to that particular soundbite, saying, look at what happened in Rwanda.
I think it's a bit unfortunate to even begin to suggest such a comparison. I think what we have in Kenya, which is exactly what I was talking about, is a manufactured crisis. It is a crisis that is deliberately contrived to create an effect. And the effect here is to coerce, to threaten, to cajole, and to push the state into making certain concessions. certain political concessions. To understand this manufactured crisis, you just need to go back to August 2022 in the immediate aftermath of the last election. An election that yielded a very clear outcome and a very clear winner in the name of President Ruto. A result that was contested in court. And a result that was validated by the Supreme Court. But again, a result or a determination that was repudiated by Raila Odinga and his entire team in the name of calling this judgment illegitimate. And so what we saw from that point on was an attempt to manufacture a crisis, to mobilize dissent, and to basically leverage on issues of livelihoods that citizens were experiencing, including economic difficulty. And so we have seen a morphing of the demand set by the opposition, all of which designed to create a crisis. And so what I was telling the international community is that, and I was making very clear legal reference to the Vienna Convention on diplomatic relations, which speaks to the principle, the cardinal principle of non-interference, right? And I was making the argument as well based on another principle or another very important doctrine of international law based on the Declaration of Principles of International Law on Friendly Relations and Cooperations among states. All of those principles speak to the fact that as much as possible, there should be forbearance on the part of the international community from speaking to or inserting themselves in a political process, because to do that would actually arm, it would provide armory or anchorage to actors who want to defeat legitimate democratic outcomes. And that is the situation that is obtaining right now in Kenya. It has nothing to do with a genocidal intent. It has nothing to do with mass atrocities that have been witnessed. What we have seen is a riotous mob that has been mobilized, radicalized, financed, and deployed to cause mayhem and to create chaos. And in responding to this mayhem, then we have had this kind of altercations that we are talking about. But really, we are not anywhere close to invoking this very important doctrine known as humanitarian intervention, or the responsibility to protect, as my brother Migai, would have urged.
Okay, and I'll come to the point of what is it that is exactly so offensive or overstepping that the international community has said, because I will pull up the mission statement that was, joint mission statement that was released by some embassies in Kenya. But first, this was your response to this statement from the UN Office on Human Rights. While regretting and decrying the unfortunate loss of life or injury, the reckless mobilization of lawless gangs to loot, destroy property, disrupt business, deprive many of means of livelihood, and create an environment of disorder must receive equal condemnation. But what was so wrong about the United Nations Office on Human Rights simply saying, which the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights talked about today, and not just them, but several entities, which is we call for prompt, thorough, independent, and transparent investigations into the deaths and injuries. Those responsible must be held to account. Effective measures to prevent further deaths and injuries must be adopted. Isn't this the hallmark of a democracy?
You see, any statement of fact that is submitted must be supported the Office of the High Commission for Human Rights put out this statement talking about 23 people having been killed with absolutely no evidence whatsoever to support that view. Okay? And so by banding around a figure, the basis of which was reports probably from civil society
which they have
organizations.
stated here because they say
Okay.
reports.
How would you, as the United Nations, make a statement of that nature that you have not been able to verify yourself independently? A statement that can inflame passion and create even more disquiet and disaffection. Why would you make a statement of that nature? What warranted the timing of this statement?
Now, the figure, this 23 figure, right, is on the conservative side. If you look at the figures released by IMLU, who have carried out their own independent verification.
Has it been verified?
Amnesty International. Now, the Independent Policing Oversight Authority, and I hosted one of the commissioners here, John Waiganjo, stated that they have not been receiving, because police are required to report any and all shootings to them. They have not been receiving that information. So where would the UN get this information? And they have qualified this statement by saying reports.
So what would your proposition be? That we would just accept as government the view that has been bandied around, that 23 people have been killed because of because of the protest? How would we even know who is culpable for those killings? Suppose we were to assume and to accept that 23 people were killed. Who perpetrated those killings? Is it government that is culpable for those killings at all? And that's why the point government has been making is that these are not peaceful demonstrations. They are riotous mobs that have been mobilized to create chaos, to destroy property, and in the context of the police responding, what we have seen is some of these mobs attacking the police. And we have hundreds of policemen right now nursing injuries in hospital. 300 plus of them are today nursing injuries. And I from the statement of my brother Raymond Omolo, the PS for Interior, one of them actually has succumbed to his injuries. Nobody is giving this side of the story regarding the fact that our police, that is meant to secure law and order, is on the receiving end of, quote unquote, a peaceful group of demonstrators. The reality is far from the truth. And that is why I'm saying that this is nothing but a manufactured crisis. And for the international community, particularly the UN, to speak and present a number such as 23 people having been killed is really to act out of time.
If you dispute this figure, because you're saying this figure is not anchored in fact, do you have the actual figures?
I don't.
Isn't that part of the problem?
I don't.
Is that not part of the problem? Why is the government transparent about the, quote, crimes that are being orchestrated? And those, I'm using the terms, this orgy-violent term that has been used by the Interior Cabinet Secretary, but we are not hearing anything about police using excessive force or any harm that may have come to those participating in the protests.
I think government has been very, very clear that its response has been designed at protecting life, protecting property, protecting looting, and securing the peace in many of the areas affected by the riots. Government has been very, very categorical in that respect.
So you deny that there has been, in your view, excessive use of force by the police?
I'm not the spokesperson for the police. Those are questions.
No, but you are disputing these figures.
I'm
you're disputing these figures,
the figure
but you're
23.
disputing them on what basis?
All right.
Do you have alternative figures?
I do have alternatives.
So what are the alternative figures?
The alternatives for me are the fact that, to the best of my knowledge, the Cabinet Secretary for Interior has given the number of 7 having been killed. Okay? There's been several details issued by the State Department for Interior in terms of how many fatalities there has been, how many injuries there has been, how many houses have been destroyed, how many police stations have been torched. Those numbers are out there. Okay?
All right. Raila Odinga made certain allegations today, and I'll not take a break before we come back with that. But the allegations have to do with the targeting of a particular community. And I'm curious what you make of those remarks. We'll find out what the Principal Secretary has to say on that. All right, I'm just pulling up a couple of tweets that were posted by Raila Odinga today in condemning excessive use of force by police. He did speak of targeted attacks. Here it is. And he says in these protests, the police are partisan. They have ethnic formations and they're pursuing an ethnic agenda. That is why we believe we're in the formative stages of genocide and political persecution sanctioned by the state. Your thoughts?
It's just really unfortunate that he would say something like that. I think it's even reckless on his part to bandy around words such as genocide. The reality, Olive, is, like I said, to just look at where we were and to ask ourselves what is going on. I said before, this is a manufactured crisis. It is convenient to label it in those very graphic and stark terms so that people out there can be able to feel like there's something huge that is taking place in Kenya. But really what is taking place is a political player who has been part of creating political crisis in the country over the last 2 decades. If there is a constant player who has leveraged on crisis to access power, I think his name is very well known. It is unfortunate that 2 decades down the line, from 2007 to the present, we can see the same player, again leveraging on the vulnerability of citizens to be able to create a narrative where the facts cannot support it. The reality is there is neither targeted killings, there is no focus on a specific ethnicity, there is no genocide, there is no persecution that is taking place in Kenya. What is happening is a political contest where Honorable Raila unfortunately has lost, and now there is a desire to manufacture a crisis.
Now, even if I was to concede that the crisis is manufactured, which I have not, looking at the police response, are you saying the United Nations, organizations, the civil society in Kenya, organizations such as IMLU, Amnesty International, to name just a few, the clergy, churches have come out, be they Muslim, Christian, Hindu, they're all saying or castigating, the Kenya Conference of Catholic Bishops, all saying if there has been excess, there must be investigations. Let me put it that way. Investigations into allegations and reports, given the information that they have, that there has been excessive use of force. Are you saying all these people, even the media, who have been saying, let us save our country, have lost their minds?
Really, I don't want to talk about the independence of the media in this country. Okay? The media has a role to play, and the role revolves around telling the truth, giving Kenyans the real version of what is happening. The inability of our media to look back at the genesis of this manufactured crisis. Its failure to call it by its name and to call out Raila Odinga for failing to become a responsible leader in the face of his failed bid at the presidency. I think it's really unfortunate. But that's not really my role today. It's not my role to castigate the media. I respect my friends in civil society. I respect the opposition as well. But nevertheless, I think my own view really, is that what we are all saying is that we do not need to allow what is really a political issue to turn into a violent encounter. We do not have to use the economic challenges that our citizens are going through, which government is trying to address. We do not have to take advantage of the vulnerability of our citizens, in order to mobilize them to become tools, that would serve a political objective. What is happening in Kenya is not what is being portrayed in the media, what is being captured in many reports that are written, by a lot of civil society players, some of whom I really respect. What is really happening in Kenya is the fact that our politicians, particularly the opposition, have refused to concede defeat in the face of a very transparent and clear electoral process.
There's somebody who took the media to task on the framing of this protest. We have been framing it as Azimio protests. We have been framing it as anti-government protests. While there may be those who have joined the protest to protest the overtaxation they perceive is being imposed on them by this administration. Are we doing them a disservice, in your view?
I think the media is doing a disservice to the country, actually, in many ways. The reality is people are facing difficult economic situations. That's the reality. But does that need to devolve into chaos? Does it need to devolve into destruction of property and mayhem? People may disagree, rational people may disagree about the fairness or justice of tax policy proposals that government has made. But do those same reasonable people then take stones and throw them at each other? Do they burn houses? The reality is no. What is at play in the few areas that we have witnessed violence is that political actors who want to make a political case leverage on these vulnerabilities of the people and stir them to violence. That's really what we're talking about. So this is not necessarily a people's protest to be heard in terms of, all right, the Beya Unga hasn't gone down. No, it's really about political players trying to make a point.
But isn't that at the heart of all disputes, ultimately? When nations have degenerated,
it can be
political issues that are at the root, ultimately. It is how they're addressed that makes all the difference.
It can be at the heart of a dispute, but that dispute need not devolve into the chaos and mayhem that has been manufactured in order to coerce and force the hand of government into negotiating for certain preordained political outcomes. That's all.
Now, part of the issue that has been raised is that the fact that government continues to say this is the protesters who are violent, as they have been described by yourself, who are the ones who are meting out violence against the police. Who holds the instruments of power? To whom does the greater responsibility lie? Who is expected to exercise restraint? Is it not the authorities? And at the very minimum, wouldn't you welcome calls for investigate.
Did you see the restraint exercised by the police on Wednesday last week? What was the consequence of that restraint? We saw in Mlolongo a mob, a gang of hired guns, destroy the expressway. That was restraint in action. It was demonstrated for the whole country to see, all right? So when the police, in seeking to quell this kind of a riot, begin to respond, and they are visited with stones, they are visited with missiles, the police are under the duty to restore peace and order and calm where none exists, right? So it is in that contestation that sometimes, unfortunately, you know, somebody could be hurt, somebody could be maimed, somebody could lose their life. But it's in the context of responding to very, very serious provocations by hired guns. But that's not to say then that there is no need for investigation. That's not to say that our police are perfect. There is still a long way to go in terms of making our police that perfect force for good that it ought to be. It's not. There's quite some work to be done. And it's quite possible that if an investigation were to be lodged, mistakes will be established on the part of the police. But that's not to say that they're acting based on premeditation, that they're acting based on a certain policy, a certain targeting. The police only focus at this point in time is to respond in the direction of minimizing and mitigating the extent to which loss of life, destruction of property, etc., will be occasioned by this riot.
Let's take a look at this statement that was issued by ambassadors and high commissioners in Kenya on the demonstrations, and they say they were saddened by the loss of life and concerned by high levels of violence, including the use of live rounds and the destruction of property during the recent demonstrations. They say we recognize the daily hardship faced by many Kenyans, as you have, and urge all parties to table their concerns through a meaningful dialogue and resolve their differences peacefully to build the nation together, ensuring no further loss of life. And they continue to say we stand ready to support the parties in their efforts to find constructive and peaceful solutions. Did you take any issue with this statement?
I think I have already indicated the issue that I took.
With the UN statement?
With the UN statement.
Yes, any issue with this particular statement?
I took issue with this statement. Mm-hmm. And I took issue with this statement because it made certain presumptions. Okay? And the key presumption here is that it did not call on responsibility on the part of those who are protesting. All right? And then it also presumed, it also called for meaningful dialogue. So the question then is, what does that actually entail? You know, what are the particulars of this meaningful dialogue? All right? Because we have a country called Kenya that is governed by a constitutional order, by a legal order. We have institutions that function. We have a legislature. We have a judiciary. We have an executive arm of government. All these institutions are responding. And even in relation to an issue such as the contentious Finance Act, for example, the courts have already spoken to that issue. They've already issued an injunction with respect to that issue. That is an institutional response to this challenge. In the same vein, we have a legislative organ in this country, both Senate and the National Assembly. We have a process that was initiated within the context of these institutions. And so government is working through institutions. The key question one has to ask is, what platform does Honorable Raila Odinga speak from? What legitimate platform does he really speak from? Is he speaking from the legislative platform, or from the judicial platform or from the executive platform. He doesn't have a legitimate platform from where to engage. And that's partly why we're saying that the government will work through legitimate institutions, including the bipartisan parliamentary framework that was established. And I don't want to apportion blame in terms of who walked away from that process. But those are the frameworks that exist. Because if we continue as a country to look outside our constitutional order to seek the resolution of our challenges, then we are not really a constitutional state.
Article 37 is not outside the constitutional order.
Right?
Is it? You're the lawyer.
Yes.
It is not outside the Constitution.
What about it?
And that is the avenue that Raila Odinga has chosen to take. So when you say he is not working within the legitimate institutions.
We are talking about context. You know?
You mean the meaningful dialogue?
This is the statement you
Okay.
gave me, all right?
All right. Now, so when you say the international community should refrain from speaking too soon or out of turn, you're saying they should have said nothing at all or rephrased it?
I'm saying that their statement, and we have tremendous respect for the international community, okay? We have an excellent relationship across the board with the international community. However, when it comes to matters such as these issues that we are dealing with as a country, our institutions have the capacity to deal with these issues. And it is too soon for them to insert themselves into the conversation, because what it does is that it emboldens certain players who are seeking precisely this kind of an attention in order to say that, look, the international community has spoken. That's really what you said, right? The church has spoken. The civil society has spoken, isn't it?
Yes.
That's exactly what you're saying. So it sustains this siege mentality that is being created and manufactured by the media, okay? So that the government can somehow be coerced into making certain concessions outside the strictures of our constitutional order.
Now, there are those who would argue that by taking that position, you want to have your cake and eat it. We welcome the international community when we need donor funding for projects, when we are suffering from famine, we invite them in, but you're saying on political issues, they should mind their own business.
We have an excellent framework of partnership with the international community, including on building capacity, of civil society, building capacity of state institutions, including in the governance arena. Okay? Those institutions whose capacity the international community has built now respond, okay? Because they are the entities that the Kenyan state recognizes. Okay? They are the entities that represent the aspirations of the Kenyan people. The international community plays a very important role. All we are saying at this point in time is, like I said before, these are matters that the Kenyan state, these are conversations that the Kenyan people are having with itself. The Kenyan nation, the Kenyan communities are having this conversation with itself.
And you actually preempted me because you said they've invested. It's my interpretation of what you said. Heavily in this country, there's the argument that if Kenya is an anchor state in the region, so if Kenya goes down, that it reverberates across the region. So you would understand then, would you not, why the international community would be keen to keep the peace in Kenya?
The international community is a partner in Kenya's sustainable development. Okay? But the leadership in relation to these processes belongs to Kenya. It belongs to the Kenyan state, it belongs to Kenyan institutions, it belongs to the Kenyan people. Right? That's all we are saying.
Kenya is seeking to mediate the peace in DRC, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Sudan, and actually speaking of Sudan, I'd like to play a soundbite and get your reaction to that. Then for Kenya to turn back around and say, but when it comes to our affairs, keep off. Is that not a hypocritical stance in your view?
It's not. Look at it this way. So in DRC, Kenya has been invited to intervene by the state itself through the aegis of the East African community. In Sudan, Kenya, acting in concert under the IGAD framework, has been invited to engage. In Ethiopia, Kenya has been invited by the Ethiopian government itself. Kenya is neutral. Kenya is committed to its neighbors and the peace of our neighborhood. It is not involved in any internal developments that are taking place in those countries. And so it's a completely different context that you're talking about. At what stage did Kenya invite the kind of voices you're talking about?
These are the countries, if I think of Ethiopia, did they necessarily invite the international community or IGAD or whatever agencies to get involved in their business? Wasn't there pressure from the outside that this situation has to be resolved?
I think there was. Again, it's all really about context, okay? You know, like making the comparisons that you're making doesn't necessarily speak to our situation, because we are talking about a state that has very credible institutions, okay? A state that has run a political process, an election, an outcome, and an outcome that is challenged and validated. You know, you're talking about a state that is fully functional. But then, on the other hand, you're talking about, if you're talking about DRC that has had problems in the eastern DRC region for over 30 years, that has a UN mission that has sat there for 10 years plus, you're talking about a different context.
I will concede that point. All right, speaking of Kenya's neutrality on the regional front, let's listen into what Kalonzo Musyoka had to say on the Sudan situation.
General Buhran on the one hand, and Hamedi, who was supposed to be the vice chair of the council. Quite frankly, it's a very difficult situation. I know that some in this part of the world wanted to intervene, and then others said, no, we think you're part of the problem. So we, as a country, are very concerned. And if there's anything that we can do from the point of view of the Horn of Africa crisis, that's why our leader, Brother Raila, was very clear about this.
Is Kenya a neutral party in the Sudan situation? There have been allegations that it is not, and that one of the parties there has disputed Kenya's involvement in any sort of negotiations.
You know, Kenya respects our neighboring states. Our record on this front is completely unimpeachable. Kenya has absolutely no other interest in Sudan except the peace and security of its people. What Kenya's position is, perhaps part of the reason that has contributed to this perception, is that Kenya's position has been that it's important to go back to where the crisis hit Sudan. And the crisis hit Sudan when there was a coup that ousted a military regime, and then came in civilians. These civilians, working together with the military, cobbled a framework that was being negotiated, that was negotiating the peace, and had very clear timelines to ensure the transition of Sudan to a democratic state. Now, what has then happened is that that process was disrupted by this new conflict. And what we have seen is the meltdown in Sudan, Olive. What we've seen is the destruction of Khartoum, critical infrastructure being destroyed, huge hotels being brought down, bombings, destruction of roads and bridges, the closure of the airport, and the closure of the airspace. This is a huge crisis. And to expect then that there is a legitimate authority in Sudan that can address these issues is to be unrealistic. And therefore, as the international community in the region, namely IGAD, because IGAD is empowered under its statutes, sitting under the AU framework, to be able then to curate a solution. And it's within that context that IGAD has come up with a mechanism led by Kenya, but including Ethiopia, including Djibouti, including South Sudan, to try to address this problem. All right? And so, it's a completely different context that is nothing compared, to what is going on in Kenya.
All right, I'm looking at the clock and I'm seeing that I'm running out of time, but I thought I should invite you to weigh in on this. This was a story that was carried in the Daily Nation the other day. U.S. gets tough in trade deal talks with Kenya administration, and there was reference in the article to enshrinement of respect for freedom of expression and the like. There was also talk that Catherine Tai, the lady in question, the U.S. Trade Envoy here, snubbed the CS for Trade, Moses Kuria, on at least 2 occasions of note for me. You have had to come up and sort of, in my view, clean up statements he has made with regard, I can't remember whether it was Sudan or South Sudan, and there was a whole China Square debacle. What is happening with government communication, especially where it touches on Kenya's partners? And was it indeed true, Moses Kuria, and the type of statements he's made on his social media go against the tenets of a thriving or of a democracy?
Well, Moses Kuria is a very important cabinet secretary. He drives our trade and our investment policy. As Foreign Affairs, we are not aware that there was any snub on the part of the trade representative of the U.S. All we know is that the trade representative had very cordial meetings with the administration at the highest level, met with His Excellency the President, and prosecuted a very important agenda. I think really it's very important for us not to focus on the sideshows. The fundamentals of our relationship with the U.S. are solid, and they're based on very foundational values. We both share values of democracy, values of free speech, free expression, and democratic governance. And so, on the basis of all those values and the basis of the partnership that we've had for many years, we have absolutely no doubt that our relationship will only continue to flower and to flourish.
What about the statements that have been released by Moses Kuria that you have later had to come in and, quote, clarify? the government position?
I always clarify what belongs to the domain of foreign relations. My focus is to make sure that statements are understood in their proper context, and therefore my statements are always, they seek to provide additional information and additional context so that there's no, there's no misunderstanding, so to speak.
Okay. But have you had a discussion about this behind the scenes so that you don't have to later come back and have the need to clarify?
Language is, sometimes it's not as precise as we like it to be. We can say something when in fact the meaning that we wanted to attach to those words is entirely different. And so I think we will always provide additional clarification. I'm sure there is something that I've said in this broadcast, that somebody might find fault with it, and I might have to come back and clarify.
All right, I will end the conversation there. We've had in studio the Principal Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Korir Singoe, and we've been discussing the thin line between sovereignty and multilateralism. You have been watching, with all due respect, with Olive Barrows. You're shaking your head. Why are you shaking your head? Why are you shaking your head?
Where was the multilateralism? Anyway.
We are called a community of nations, but you have said correct?
Sure.
Yeah, but you're saying in this certain respects where the political situation in Kenya is concerned, sovereignty reigns supreme, is my understanding. Anyway, you can find the conversation on the NTV Kenya YouTube channel. My name is Olive Barrows, a sign language interpreter. I see she has left for the night. Flora Atieno. Have yourself a good night.